Hey everybody, I'm Ben Yee, State Committee for New York 66th Assembly District and Secretary of the Manhattan Democratic Party.
I'm Alyssa Stein. I am a County Committee member, Secretary of the 66 Part A, and we're here on our new set.
New set,
new angles, making sure everybody's hair looks good.
It's winter, it's cold, they took away all the tables and chairs, we're sitting on the floor.
On the floor.
But we're still doing it.
Because there's lots to talk about.
There's always, this is important stuff.
Local politics is important, although today we're talking about local, we're talking about state, we're talking about national, because we're going to be talking about the elections that took place last week.
Oh yes, indeed.
Where a lot of Democrats won, which was heartening and exciting and gave many people hope that perhaps change is in the air. So when I said that, you said,
Well,
so expand on that a little bit.
Definitely changes in the air, and the Democrats won a bunch of things, but we shouldn't think that it's a market change necessarily. It's going to tip the balance and make everything progressive and democratic. To me, it doesn't look like a gigantic rejection of Trumpism or of the Republican Party at large. There were a bunch of elections all around the country. We can talk about the two big ones, which were New Jersey and Virginia. They had statewide elections. And then we had a bunch of local municipal elections in New York. And there were local elections all over the place. And then there are some things to talk about in Washington where the Democrats retook the state Senate. People are talking a lot about that. Let's start there, actually, because that's a pretty simple one.
Okay.
There was a special election, or there were some special elections in Washington. The Democrats took control of the Washington State Senate, which gives the Democrats what's called a trifecta, which is control of the governorship and both chambers of the legislature.
Now that in current politics in this country, the Republicans have a bunch of those.
Yeah, they have about 2/3,
Right.
almost 2/3 of the
And
legislature.
Democrats have very few.
Right, very, very few. This is a rare trifecta
So this is
for the Democrats.
this is a big deal.
It's a big deal until you consider the fact that Washington is generally considered a relatively progressive state, and the Democrats took control of the state Senate by flipping one seat.
Okay.
So it was a win, and it's great to have control of a state government to sort of balance things out.
Right.
And it's also important that the Democrats are able to flip a seat, because there are some legitimately conservative districts in Washington, and especially in the rural areas. But they moved one seat, and so you couldn't say that's a tidal wave of winning,
Change, right.
nor could you say that it is necessarily a rejection of...
But one seat can make all the difference.
One seat does make all the difference,
So
certainly.
I want to bring that back
but
to New York for a second.
yes.
Because we should have a trifecta here. Shouldn't we? No, but just
Well,
in terms of,
yeah.
because technically we have a Democratic governor, we have a Democratic assembly, and we do have the majority in the Senate, except for the IDC.
Right, so let's talk about New York's current elections for a second, and we'll deal with the IDC
Okay.
in the breadth of
Because it's
that.
always good to be talking about the IDC.
Yes, and for those who don't know, the IDC is the Independent Democratic Conference. They are a bunch of Democrats who are elected as Democrats to the state Senate, New York State Senate, but they choose to caucus with the Republicans, giving Republicans effective or functional control
Right, so there's a
of the
Republican head
New
of
York
the
State
right.
Senate.
Right.
Correct.
So if that whole thing, for people who don't already know that, because we talk about it a bunch, if they flip back to being Democrats or acting like Democrats and caucusing with the Democratic Party, then there would be a Democratic leadership
Correct.
in the Senate, and then New York would have a true trifecta
Correct.
instead of a hijacked trifecta.
That is true.
That sounds like a horror movie, hijacked
trifecta.
Yeah.
Well, we can make it.
We can.
Our next video will be the hijack trifecta horror film.
I love that.
Yes, but
Okay.
insofar as ramifications from this last election, obviously New York City, we had results that were relatively predictable.
Unexpected. Yeah.
No, they were expected. Democrats swept everything.
They demonstrate, right.
The really important races, which would have been indicative of anything going on, sort of larger or more deeply a shift in politics, were the races upstate for county executive, particularly Westchester, which is a big county and has leaned Republican for a long time. Their current county executive is Rob Astorino, who is a two-term incumbent Republican county executive and was one of Trump's earliest and vocal supporters. This dude is a Tea Party Republican. He was challenged in the general election by George Latimer, who's a pretty progressive Democrat who is currently a sitting state senator. Now, George Latimer won this race, right? So he'll become the new county executive in January. This is pretty important. Trump lost Westchester as a whole, but he won some towns in Westchester, although it was very slim margins. So Westchester is what you might call like a traditional Republican area, although that's sort of like losing its meaning now that the entire Republican Party is becoming Tea Party and just nuts. But they're sort of like a traditional conservative, wealthy place, and the fact that Rob Astorino, they've had Republican county execs for the last, I don't know, 20 years or something, I want to say. I looked into this for a hot minute, but they've had a lot of them. And so Rob Astorino is a second-term incumbent, and he was defeated by a progressive Democrat, in theory because he was so vocally in favor of Trump, and Westchester just wasn't having it.
Okay, so but that's a really good sign, even though you say that this wasn't necessarily an election as rejection of Trumpism.
This, I think, was the biggest one.
Right.
This is the thing that you could point to most clearly and say, this county was closely, there were pockets in this county that voted for Trump, and that elected a Trump-like county executive,
right,
and they flipped.
So, in super small terms, yay, that's really heartening. And not to say that going forward, because what we want to talk about today too is this happened, and this was great. For whatever reason,
yes,
more Democrats were elected, and that's
right.
great. So 2018 is a year where there are many more elections coming up where it really matters.
Yes.
So I want to make sure that we have time, because now we're at 7 minutes.
So let's do New Jersey and Virginia.
Okay.
Where,
which also nail-biting, very exciting,
yes,
very nerve-wracking.
Well, actually, there's one last thing I want to say about New York.
Okay.
George Latimer, because he won this seat, will now have to vacate his state Senate seat in January, which will lead... Oh, actually, they might not have a special election because we elect the Senate next year anyway.
So it could just remain empty until next
It could, but there will be no... No, actually, there will be a special election. I'm sorry, I take it back. I know people who are running for it. But what it really means is there's no incumbent Democrat in that state Senate seat. And because Westchester is a conservative county, it'll be interesting to see
what happens
in the state Senate, because we've lost a solid Democratic seat. There'll be a strong contest, I imagine, between a Democrat, a Republican, and the IDC in the mix.
I have a question.
Yes.
And it's going to relate to a national story.
Yes.
Which is the filling of Jeff Sessions' seat and the big brouhaha about Roy Moore and all that stuff. But he's been Secretary of State for quite some time now.
Yes.
That seat has remained empty.
Yeah.
How does one decide, or how is it decided when a special election will happen? So which is going to have to happen now in New York.
Right.
But who decides the timing? How do people get into the race? Like, how does that work?
Sure. Okay, so I'll cover this and then we'll go on to New Jersey and Virginia.
Okay.
Since this is also an election that's coming up. I'm not sure how it works in Alabama, but certainly in New York, the governor calls the special election and he gets to determine the date. Because in this case it's Andrew Cuomo.
Right.
And so he'll actually be calling special elections to fill Brian Kavanaugh's assembly seat in District 74 in New York City, and George Latimer's Senate seat in Westchester.
So are there not bylaws, is it in the Constitution? Is there a certain date?
Right, so it'll be in the election law,
Okay.
the rules around all of that. And again, I can't speak necessarily for Alabama. It's common that the governor gets to call it, and they'll set the date. Sometimes it's within a restricted time frame, sometimes it's not.
Okay.
And so...
And then there's not a primary, because there's no... so how do people get to run for these positions?
So there's not in some states you do have generally nonpartisan primaries. This is relatively uncommon. There was actually a primary in Alabama for Roy Moore's seat. Roy Moore ran against
Luther Strange.
Exactly, Luther Strange. And so Alabama does have rules for primaries before special elections.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
In any event.
Right, that was a tangent, but...
Let's get back, because we're already at the 10-minute mark, to Virginia, New Jersey. So, Virginia, as we had sort of been talking about, New Jersey, as we had sort of been talking about before, they had a very unpopular
so
Governor
that wasn't,
Chris Christie.
So a Democrat winning was not necessarily a repudiation of Trump, it was a repudiation of Chris Christie.
Who was super unpopular, corrupt.
That was a fall from grace, from that 5 minutes of grace.
Right.
He fell hard.
It was very expected that a Democrat would overtake a Republican in a situation like that. And we shouldn't be super surprised if there were a FEC's down ticket for state legislature races. But that being said, the shift in the state legislature was only by like 2 or 3 seats. There weren't big shifts in New Jersey. I will say this, there was a Senate candidate for which I went to go canvass, Christine Chen in Senate District, or Legislative District 23. The way New Jersey does it is every legislative district gets 1 senator and 2 assembly members. So there was a ticket of a Democratic Senate candidate and 2 assembly members. The Senate candidate got about 40% of the vote in a district which is heavily Republican. So this was Senate District 23, or Legislative District 23. And it's been held by Republicans for a long time, for the last 30 years or something. And 41% is a significant bump up from where it had been in previous general elections. But depending on which election you look at, it's a 5 to 10% bump. Now, a 5 to 10% bump in Republican districts around the country would be a really big shift. And I'm sure some of this has to do with what's going on in Washington and with Trump. It wasn't enough to actually win the election, though. But I will say that Jersey's Legislative District 23 is part of Lance, what's his name? One of the most flippable congressional districts in the country.
Okay, so that's potential to good news.
Right, so cumulative bumps around that congressional district might be meaningful. But this can't be done. Don't think that we can sit back and expect everybody to turn out and the country to flip without putting in a lot of effort.
Well, so that's what I want to talk about next, because now we're running out of time.
Let's do Virginia real quick.
Okay, Virginia, like speed Virginia.
Virginia, I think, is a pretty simple thing. Everybody's saying, oh, it's amazing, the Democrats picked up more seats than they have in any election since like the 1800s.
I know, it was exciting.
It was a humongous win.
That was a good night.
It's a humongous win. Except you have to understand that while the Republicans have controlled about 2/3 of the legislature since Barack Obama, Virginia's a pretty split state. They had an outgoing Democratic governor and they got another Democratic governor. The state Senate of Virginia is 50-50, or really it's I think 51-49 in favor of Republicans. So the fact that the Democrats have a 1-vote minority or somewhere around there's 3 races which are too close to call, but currently they're at basically a 1 or 2 vote minority in the House of Delegates. The fact that that just mirrors the Senate is not, to me, an indication that there's a massive wave against the current establishment. As far as I'm concerned, we've reestablished status quo from before Barack Obama's 2010 midterm losses.
That's fascinating.
Now, the one thing I will say is the state Senate was not up for election in Virginia this year. So that body was elected in 2015 and is now still sitting in 2017. So it's a data point really from before Trump went into office. That's how close it was before Trump went into office. And we're seeing a replication of that now in the House of Delegates and a maintenance of a Democratic governor.
I feel like somebody's slowly letting the air out of the balloon.
What this means is that the Democrats are not dead as a party.
Right.
And if the Democratic Party can get its act together, and if people who care about these issues, be they Democrats or not, participate in the next round of elections and are active, that there's space for gains.
Right.
Donald Trump's election did not destroy progressivism or tolerance or a sort of politics where people care about each other or are willing to include folks of different ethnicities or sexual orientation or religious backgrounds. What we saw was that America is still America. And in a good and just America, the Democrats have as good a chance of winning elections as any conservative or Republican party.
All right, so we've hit our time limit, but I have 2 quick questions, and maybe we're going to do a part 2.
Okay.
We'll talk about this next time. 1, Tom Perez mentioned that they're going to start working from the bottom up,
Yes.
as Republicans have for years, to win school board seats and county committee seats and
Yes.
state level things. And if he means that, and the DNC puts its money where its mouth is, and they start funding those things and working at that grassroots level and up, that seems like a good way to make change happen going forward.
Yes.
So hopefully that's true. And the second thing that you touched on that I think is so important that we should continue talking about is what do we need to do to make 2018 a real turnaround year, because that's when so many elections are happening. And you're right, we can't just sit back and think, oh, the tide is shifting. It's going to take real groundwork to make change happen.
Those topics and more next time on Real Politics, the TV show.
Bye.